What does it look like when 3 people vanish? No chaos, no signs of struggle, just 3 people in a house on a quiet street in Missouri, and then gone without a trace. On June 7th, 1992, Springfield, Missouri, sometime between midnight and morning, Sherrill Levitt and her daughter Susie and Susie's best friend Stacy McCall ceased to exist. Officially, they are still missing, and the case is still open, and someone is still looking. But here's what 30 years of official investigative work looks like. No arrest, no charges, no bodies ever found. They had DNA from the scene, and the families didn't know it existed for 14 years. There's a man who has basically told people he knows what happened to these women, and the perpetrator still walks free. Before we get into what went wrong, let me tell you who these 3 women actually were. Sherrill Levitt was 47 years old, a hairdresser, recently divorced and rebuilding her life on her own terms. By every account from the people who knew her, they described her as warm, open, and the kind of person who would help anyone who needed it. She owned the house on East Delmar Street. It was her space, her fresh start. Susie Streeter was 19, the daughter of Sherrill Levitt. Following her mother into the hair industry, she was a student at a local beauty school, close to her mother in a way that actually matters. Not just related, actually close. Stacy McCall was 18, Susie's best friend since childhood. On June 7th, 1992 was graduation night at Kickapoo High School. They had both just finished one of the biggest nights of their young lives. Stacy had originally planned to stay at another friend's house that night. The plans changed at the last minute. That detail, the last minute change of plans, is one of the things that haunts this case. If Stacy had stuck to the original plan, would she have disappeared? Was Sherrill the target? Were all 3? Did someone know exactly who would be at that house that night? Those questions don't have answers, because the investigation that went into the disappearance of these 3 women was compromised from the very beginning. Not because the case was impossible, not because the evidence wasn't there, but it's because the people in charge of finding them made a series of decisions, early, critical decisions, that ensured this case would never be properly solved. Let's go through it. June 6, 1992 was graduation night. Susie and Stacy attended the Kickapoo High School graduation ceremony. They go to graduation parties. Multiple witnesses placed them at several locations through the evening. By all accounts, they were in good spirits. It's one of the biggest nights of their lives. At some point in the early morning hours on June 7th, they end up at Sherrill's house on East Delmar Street. Sherrill was home that evening. A neighbor reports seeing lights on in the house. Another neighbor reports hearing a brief, sharp sound, described as possibly a dog yelping at some point during the night. The time of that sound has never been precisely established. By morning, all 3 women are gone. Now let me walk you through what was found in that house. Because the scene tells a story, and the story it tells is not one of 3 women who decided to leave. The front door was found unlocked. The TV was left on. Cigarettes burning in the ashtray, burned all the way down to ash, which means they were lit and then abandoned, which means whatever happened quickly enough that no one stopped to put out the cigarette. Food was left out on the counter. All 3 women's purses were inside the home. Car keys inside the house. Stacy McCall's contact lenses in their case on the bathroom shelf. I want to stop at that last one. If you wear contact lenses, you understand what this means. You do not leave your house at night voluntarily without your contact lenses. You cannot see properly without them. Stacy McCall's contact lenses sitting in their case on that bathroom shelf is one of the most unambiguous pieces of evidence in this entire case, that whatever happened was not voluntary. And then there was the porch light. The cover of the porch light was shattered on the ground outside the front door. Broken glass on the porch. This is the only physical evidence of anything having gone wrong outside of the home. One shoe found outside near the porch. Think about what this scene is telling you. 3 women were inside that house, awake, sitting, smoking, and then something happened. Fast enough that no one stubbed out a cigarette. Fast enough that no one grabbed their purse or their keys. Fast enough that someone lost a shoe on the way out and couldn't go back for it. Fast enough that one of them never retrieved her contact lenses from the bathroom. And not a single neighbor reports hearing anyone screaming. No screaming. No sounds of struggle. No signs of a fight inside the home. A broken porch light, a single shoe, and not a single woman in sight. The scenario that fits this evidence most consistently is that someone they knew. Someone they opened the door to without alarm. Someone who had a method of controlling 3 people quickly and quietly. Someone who knew that house or knew who would be in it that night. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because the people whose job it was to read that scene and follow it wherever it led didn't do that. Not properly, not completely, and not fast enough. Now here's what went wrong. This isn't a story about an investigation that tried and failed. This is a story about an investigation that didn't fully try. To 3 families who had spent 30 years without an answer. When Stacy McCall's parents became concerned and went to the house on June 7th, what they find inside is something that raises even more questions than answers. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No visible sign of a break-in. The only thing that were missing were the women themselves. They walked through the scene. They touched things. They moved through the rooms where evidence existed before law enforcement had fully processed those rooms. Other family members and friends entered the house before it was properly secured as a crime scene. This is not a criticism of the families. They were terrified. They were looking for the people they loved. The criticism goes to law enforcement who allowed this to happen. They did not immediately recognize what the scene was telling them and act accordingly. The first hours of any investigation are the most critical for evidence collection. Whatever forensic evidence existed at that house on the morning of June 7th was potentially compromised before investigators understood they were dealing with something that required maximum forensic attention. The broken porch light cover. The shattered glass on the ground outside the front door was the only physical evidence of disturbance at the scene. It was not properly documented and preserved in the critical early hours of the investigation. Think about what that means. The one piece of physical evidence that suggested something went wrong outside of the threshold, the point of entry or exit, was not treated with the forensic care it deserved at the moment when that care was most possible. Since the women were adults and that there were no obvious signs of foul play visible on first inspection, the initial response treated the situation more as a missing persons case rather than a crime scene. Technically, adults can leave voluntarily, but the evidence in that house, the purses, the keys, the contact lenses, the cigarettes burning to ash, that should have told investigators immediately that voluntary departure was not what had happened here. The framing of the case in its first hours shapes everything that follows. Resources, urgency, forensic priority. If you frame 3 missing adults as a voluntary situation rather than a crime scene, you investigate it like a voluntary situation, and the window for finding critical evidence closes while you're still deciding what you're dealing with. Multiple witnesses were interviewed in the early days of the investigation. People who were in the neighborhood that night. People who saw things. People whose accounts contained details that warranted follow-up questioning. Some of those witnesses were interviewed once and not re-interviewed. Independent investigators who reviewed the case in the subsequent years identified specific witness accounts that contained information pointing towards leads that were not fully pursued. Those leads went cold not because they led nowhere, but because no one followed them far enough to find out where they led. Robert Craig Cox is the most prominent named person of interest in this case. He was in Springfield around the times of the disappearances. He had a prior kidnapping conviction in Florida. While in prison on unrelated charges, he made statements to other inmates suggesting the knowledge of the case, reportedly indicating the women were dead and would never be found. He has been interviewed multiple times over the years. He has never been charged. He has never been definitively cleared. What is documented is this: the handling of Robert as a person of interest has been inconsistent. Interviews that produce cryptic statements were not always followed with the intensity those statements warranted. The full scope of his activities around the time of the disappearances was not comprehensively reconstructed and documented in the way a suspect of his profile deserved. And then there's the DNA. In 2006, 14 years after the disappearances, Springfield Police Department acknowledged for the first time they had an unmatched male DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. A DNA profile from the scene of a triple disappearance sat unmatched in a database for 14 years before it was publicly disclosed that it existed. That profile has still never been publicly matched to any individual. I want you to sit with what that means. There is biological evidence from that house on East Delmar Street. Evidence from the scene where 3 women were last seen alive. That evidence points to a specific person. That person has not been publicly identified in over 30 years. Is it because the DNA doesn't exist in any searchable database? Possibly. Is it because the investigative follow-up on that profile has been inadequate? Also possible. Is it because the profile has generated hits that have not been publicly disclosed? We don't know. Because nobody has told the families, and nobody has told the public. Here's the pattern this investigation follows. The evidence exists. The leads exist. The witnesses exist. The DNA exists. What doesn't exist was the care needed from the investigative team to locate the whereabouts of these 3 women: Sherrill Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. They deserved that care on June 7th, 1992. They are still waiting for it. 3 women in Springfield, Missouri in 1992 vanished from the locked house and left behind every item that would indicate they planned to come back. The evidence in that house told a clear story on the morning of June 7th. That story deserved a follow-up. 30 years later, it still does. The evidence in this case has always pointed somewhere. The DNA profile points to a specific person. The witness accounts point to things that were not fully followed up. The scene itself pointed, on the morning of June 7th, to something that required the full committed resources of a serious investigation. What it got instead is what we talked about today. If you know anything about the case, Springfield Police Department still has an active tip line. The number is publicly available. Cold cases get solved when someone who knows something finally decides to say it. That happens. It has happened in cases older than this one. If you found this unsolved case interesting, then please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more future uploads similar to this. And leave a comment letting me know what interested you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.